Have you ever imagined a biblical story that could change your perspective on justice, leadership, and the responsibility of our decisions? Prepare yourself, because the account you're about to discover is truly impactful, and few people have the courage to face the depths it reveals. In a scenario of betrayal, despair, and a lack of leadership, what follows is a whirlwind of consequences that goes beyond anything you can imagine. But there's something in this account that will touch your life deeply. It's not just a story from the past. It's a warning that resonates even today. Want to understand how the lack of responsibility can result in a civil war, destruction, and a disconnection from the divine? What follows will be a shocking reality check that, at the same time, offers powerful lessons for you to apply in your own path. Stay with me until the end, because by the end, you'll understand something that many overlook. True responsibility begins with our connection to God. Chapters 19 to 21 of the book of Judges contain one of the most intense and impactful narratives in the Bible. If you haven't encountered this story yet, prepare yourself, as it doesn't hold back on the details, making us understand how deep the consequences of our decisions can be. We're talking about a civil war in Israel, and what started with poor personal choices quickly turns into a collective nightmare for all the tribes of Israel. The story is shocking, not only due to the violence but also because it portrays the absence of leadership at a crucial moment. The lack of clear direction and a strong leader, something so essential in the stories of the Old Testament, triggers a series of devastating events that could have been avoided if those involved had considered their biblical responsibility in their actions. And here is where the lesson begins. Bad decisions can affect far more than just those who make them. They reverberate throughout the community. You may wonder, how is it possible for one personal decision to lead to something so big, so disastrous? The impact of an individual's actions on others is a recurring theme in the Bible, and especially in Judges 19 to 21, it becomes clear that our responsibility goes beyond ourselves. And once again, we see how disobedience to God can spread, creating a wave of destruction. Imagine the weight on those tribes, so weakened by the lack of leadership and connection with God, being dragged into a conflict that could have been avoided with more discernment. Violence and chaos spread because the leaders and the people failed to take responsibility for preserving peace, justice, and human dignity. Values that biblical lessons always teach us. What perhaps shocks us the most is the understanding that Israel, which had been formed to be an example of justice, was completely immersed in a scenario of total moral desolation. The consequences of bad decisions are like a snowball, starting small and becoming a disaster of unimaginable proportions. This story is one of the most tragic in the Old Testament. It makes us reflect on the importance of leadership, wisdom, and care in the choices we make. Instead of trusting their own vision and limited understanding, the tribes of Israel failed to seek divine guidance, and the result was a tragic and bloody outcome. A true warning to all of us about the impact of failing to listen to God's guidance. The story also serves as a significant example of the lack of hospitality, another recurring theme in the Bible. When the Levite and his concubine arrive in Gibeah, they find no welcome. What follows after this lack of hospitality is even more disturbing. This leads us to reflect on the biblical culture, which places hospitality as a fundamental value. The lesson here is clear. When we ignore the good practices that connect us to others, and more importantly, when we fail to reflect God's mercy and compassion in our actions, we pay a very high price. The lack of leadership in Israel and the failure to live according to human dignity in the Bible create a scenario of despair and violence. What could have been a simple visit turns into a series of tragedies, putting the community into a spiral of destruction. This type of narrative is not only an ancient story from another time, but also a mirror for us to reflect on the present. If we look at our society, we can perceive how seemingly small decisions, such as the lack of hospitality, responsibility, or discernment, can lead to devastating results. How often nowadays does the lack of clear leadership lead us to chaotic situations, whether in a country or in our own lives? The absence of solid principles and values, as seen in Judges, brings severe consequences and reminds us that God, throughout the entire Bible, cares about each person's choices and their impact for the good of all. It's not about being perfect, but about constantly seeking a connection with God, who guides us through life's challenges. In the end, what we learn from this episode is the importance of acting with responsibility and awareness. We cannot simply live on autopilot and ignore the implications of our decisions. Every choice we make has an impact, and often, it goes beyond what we imagine. How do you prepare for your own daily decisions? Are you constantly seeking God's direction, as many Bible stories teach us, or have you been trying to do everything on your own, without considering the weight of the consequences? When we look at the story in Judges, We clearly see that the lack of leadership and the disconnection from God led to immeasurable tragedies, and that's why we need to reflect, long before we act, on what is truly at stake in every decision we make. Now, you might be wondering, what happened to the Levite and his concubine after this? Well, the story takes even darker and crueler turns. In the next section, we will see how betrayal and the search for reconciliation become the driving force behind the tragic unfolding of events. And from there, the story only worsens, leading to the question: how far can we go when we stop listening to God's voice and distance ourselves from our responsibility to others? The story of Judges chapters 19 to 21 takes a new turn when a Levite decides to go in search of his concubine, who had left him and returned to her father's house. This act of reconciliation, however, is not a simple journey back, but an attempt to restore something broken. When the Levite sets out to find his concubine, he is seeking reconciliation, but it's important to note that this desire to restore the relationship is not a simple process. Often, when we distance ourselves from something or someone, the return is not just a matter of geography, but involves confronting what was lost, what is damaged, and, above all, the need to overcome betrayal. Betrayal, at any level, leaves deep scars, and the actions of the Levite highlight this search for restoration, but also the harsh reality that reconciliation does not always occur in the way we imagine. The concubine, upon returning to her father's house, seems to be seeking some form of protection or perhaps solace. This is an important aspect of the narrative. The woman in question was not just a concubine. She was in a vulnerable situation. This makes us reflect on the role of women in the Bible, which often illustrates themes of betrayal, suffering, and the quest for respect and dignity. The Bible does not shy away from these difficult moments and teaches us powerful lessons about the dangers of disloyalty, but also about the need for reconciliation and forgiveness. The Levite, in going after her, could be seen as someone trying to restore the broken order in his life, but this attempt is not without consequences, nor free of complications. The Levite's journey to his concubine's father's house also raises questions about the concepts of hospitality and respect. After all, he is not only searching for a woman, but also trying to restore something that was broken by betrayal. This search is full of dilemmas, and the Bible teaches us that often, attempts to restore a relationship, especially after betrayals, are not simple. The road back can be filled with obstacles, and reconciliation requires an effort that is not always recognized or accepted. The story shows us that often what we wish to restore is not something simple and direct, but something that requires much more than good intentions. The Levite situation is not only about his relationship with his concubine. Upon entering his father-in-law's house, he finds himself in a situation of negotiation and even persuasion. This makes us think of the everyday situations in which we need more than good intentions to resolve conflicts. Sometimes, we need patience, understanding, and even the help of others to try to restore what was lost. This is the critical point of the story. The Levite is not alone in this process. He needs the collaboration of others, like his father-in-law. But, as we will see later, what seemed like reconciliation will become the spark for an even greater tragedy. It's impossible not to notice that the context of reconciliation mixes with vulnerability. The woman, upon being rescued, probably imagined that by returning to her partner, something positive would happen. However, the reality of Judges 19 to 21 goes beyond simple reconciliation. It involves collective decisions, community, and responsibility. This teaches us that often the actions of a single individual affect an entire community. The way we handle mistakes, betrayals, and even attempts to fix what has been broken can have unexpected impacts, both at a personal and collective level. When one individual fails, often the consequences spread to those nearby, and reconciliation is not always enough to prevent the chaos that follows. Although the search for reconciliation is an act of faith, hope, and even courage, the story of Judges 19 to 21 warns us that good intentions don't always result in good endings. The Levite's attempt to restore his relationship with his concubine is not enough to prevent what follows. This is something that should make us reflect on the power of our actions. Often, what we begin with good intentions can take unexpected turns, especially when other elements beyond one person's control are involved. The story of the Levite and his concubine illustrates exactly this. What seemed like an attempt to make peace soon turns into a cycle of violence and tragedy. As this story continues, the reaction of the city where the Levite finds himself becomes the turning point. The initial lack of hospitality, the betrayal, and the search for reconciliation take a dark turn. When the Levite arrives in Gibeah, the city, which should have been a place of hospitality, proves indifferent and even hostile. This contrast between what is expected and what actually happens highlights how difficult it is to maintain good intentions when we are surrounded by a society that fails in its principles. The lack of welcome in Gibeah marks the beginning of what will become one of the most devastating events in all of biblical history. And it is at this point that the consequences of bad decisions begin to spread. The search for a solution and the attempt at restoration soon become futile. The lack of hospitality and the violence that follows teach us about the deep flaws in character that can arise when leadership and values are ignored. The Levite, instead of finding a peaceful solution to his situation, ends up triggering a series of events that culminate in extreme violence. This leads us to an important reflection. At what point do our actions, even those that start with good intentions, transform into something disastrous? The Bible is full of examples in which a lack of respect for human dignity and a failure to understand biblical lessons end up resulting in tragedies. As the story of the Levite and his concubine progresses, the violence in Gibeah is already in motion, and it will soon become the driving force of everything that follows. At some point, we all need to learn to discern between what is just an attempt to fix things and what is truly necessary to restore balance and peace. As the story moves forward, it becomes clear that the violence only intensifies, and the connection with God, essential in times of crisis, grows more and more distant. But what would have happened if the actions of the Levite and the community had been different? Well, this leads us to the next step in the narrative, where true destruction begins. The lack of hospitality is a central and disturbing theme in Judges chapters 19 to 21. When the Levite and his concubine arrive in Gibeah, one of the biggest shocks of the story is not only the violence that follows but the indifference of the people towards strangers. Gibeah, an Israelite city, should have been a welcoming place, an example of biblical hospitality, but instead, they encounter closed doors and a hostile environment. This moment reminds us of the importance of reflecting on hospitality in biblical culture, values that are precious but seem to be forgotten in practice. When we treat others with disregard or selfishness, the consequences can be grave and unexpected. The lack of welcome, a practice that should be a reflection of the character of a society, becomes the spark for a series of tragic events that could have been avoided. In the Bible, hospitality is more than just offering shelter. It is a principle deeply rooted in Israelite culture and biblical teachings, which teaches us about respect, care, and the importance of offering protection and safety to those in need. When Gibeah fails to welcome the Levite and his concubine, something much greater than a mere lack of kindness happens. What should have been a gesture of goodwill transforms into a reflection of a society losing its fundamental values. This episode teaches us that hospitality is a direct reflection of our connection with God. When we fail to show kindness and compassion, we are, in fact, failing to live according to the divine principles He has left us. Biblical culture teaches us that hospitality goes beyond the simple act of opening the doors of our homes. It involves a spirit of generosity, welcome, and respect. In Gibeah, the elderly man who offers shelter to the Levite and his concubine represents a rare exception, making us think about how, often, a single act of kindness can be the difference between salvation and destruction. The elderly man, with his act of hospitality, tries to preserve human dignity in the midst of a scenario of total moral and social degradation. This contrast between the welcoming of one person and the hostility of the city shows us the depth of the failure in Gibeah. When a people fails in their biblical responsibility to offer welcome, the result is the opening of doors to violence and destruction. This specific moment in Gibeah challenges us to reflect on our own attitudes towards hospitality. How are we treating others in our daily lives? Are we only opening our doors when it is convenient for us, or are we truly practicing genuine and selfless hospitality? The lesson here is clear. The lack of welcome is not a small thing. When we treat others with indifference or selfishness, we are not just disrespecting the people around us, but also disconnecting from God. The lack of hospitality in Gibeah not only led to physical violence, but also the violation of the fundamental principles of justice and humanity, which are essential to maintaining peace and order in a society. If we observe hospitality in the stories of the Bible, we see that it is much more than a simple social duty. It represents our commitment to the well-being of others, to the promotion of peace, and to justice. In Gibeah, what was expected was that the inhabitants would welcome the Levite and his concubine, providing shelter and safety. However, their reaction demonstrates the failure of society to live according to biblical teachings. This contrast in attitudes makes us ask, to what extent are our own actions aligned with divine principles? Are we truly welcoming others, or are we shutting ourselves off, ignoring what God has asked us to do? Moreover, this episode in Gibeah leads us to reflect on the culture of a community. A society that fails in its responsibility to welcome others, to show hospitality, is doomed to moral and social collapse. Gibeah, by failing to offer hospitality to the Levite, shows the depth of the moral decay of that city. The simple act of welcoming or rejecting someone can, in fact, reflect the spiritual condition of a community. How can we apply this to our lives? When we ignore the needs of others, when we fail to welcome those who are in difficulty, we are allowing our own humanity to weaken. The lack of hospitality is, therefore, not only a social failure but a spiritual failure. The event in Gibeah, with its rampant violence and clear lack of hospitality, is also a reflection of the disconnection between people and God. When a society begins to reject the fundamental values of the Bible, such as hospitality and kindness, it begins to distance itself from God. Distance from God is always a dangerous step because it results in a loss of the moral and spiritual understanding that guides us. Gibeah, by failing to welcome the Levite, failed to preserve human dignity, which is a direct reflection of God's character. And, as we will see next, this failure led to devastating consequences for all of Israel. It is at this moment that tragedy approaches. The lack of hospitality, which seemed like a small failure, opens the doors to a series of violent events that result in great losses for Israel. The violence that follows is a direct consequence of the failure to show compassion, of abandoning the biblical values of welcome and care. What seemed like a simple social failure turns into a disaster of unimaginable proportions. This episode teaches us that small failures can trigger great destructions, and that we must always act with responsibility and in accordance with God's values. As the story unfolds, we see that the lack of hospitality becomes the spark for a series of wrong decisions, leading to a civil war among the tribes of Israel. This civil war, a direct result of the lack of hospitality, is not just a physical battle but a spiritual one, a struggle for the honor of God and for human dignity. The lessons of Judges 19-21 show us that hospitality, kindness, and respect for others are essential for maintaining peace and avoiding tragedies. But what happens when the failure in hospitality leads to something much bigger? Well, what follows is even more disturbing and tragic, and we will see that in the next section. The act of violence that occurs in Gibeah, described in Judges chapters 19-21, is one of the most shocking moments in the Bible. Men of the city abused the Levite's concubine until her death, an event that undoubtedly has a devastating impact on the entire narrative. This episode not only reveals the cruelty and inhumanity of certain individuals, but also highlights the impact of the devaluation of human life. In the Bible, human dignity is a fundamental principle, and when this principle is ignored, the consequences are deep and long-lasting. The violence in Gibeah forces us to reflect on the value of life and how crucial it is to protect and honor human dignity, as God teaches us in many passages. The horrendous act of abuse and violence is not just an isolated event. It marks the point of no return for the tribes of Israel. When the Levite finds his concubine dead, he takes an action that, though extreme, aims to draw attention to what happened. He cuts her body into 12 pieces and sends them to the tribes of Israel, as a cry of indignation and a warning about what had occurred. This gesture, though shocking, is an attempt to bring to light the gravity of the crime that was committed. The Bible teaches us that justice and human dignity are precious, and when they are violated, the response must be vigorous, as seen in this moment of appeal for justice. The impact of this act of violence goes beyond the victim itself. It shakes the entire Israelite society, as it reveals the moral and spiritual failure that had infiltrated the tribes. The act of disrespecting human life, especially in the way it occurred in Gibeah, generates a wave of indignation and angry reactions in all the tribes. The story of Judges 19-21 reminds us that violence, in addition to being a violation against a human being, is also a transgression against God, the creator of life. The tragedy that unfolds is a direct consequence of this lack of respect for human life, and it forces us to reflect on what happens in our society when we fail to value human dignity. Furthermore, the act of violence in Gibeah reveals the failure to understand the messages of hope that the Bible teaches us. When human dignity is violated so extremely, we are not just attacking one person, but destroying the values that uphold the community as a whole. The Bible speaks about the importance of respecting others and acting with love and compassion, and what we see in Gibeah is a complete violation of these principles. This teaches us that when we ignore respect for human life and the dignity of others, the consequences do not only affect those directly involved, but everyone around us. The crime committed in Gibeah is not limited to the suffering of the concubine and her family, but reverberates throughout the nation of Israel. The tribes unite in a cry for justice, and the Levite, by sending the body parts of the woman, awakens a sense of indignation in each tribe. This collective response of outrage is a reflection of a society that, although flawed, still recognizes the importance of justice and human dignity. The impact of this crime is so deep that, even in the face of all the violence it provoked, there is still a cry for justice and for the restoration of the values that have been violated. This episode leads us to reflect on how we deal with violence in our own society. When something horrendous happens, such as a violation of human dignity, how do we respond? The story of Gibeah teaches us that the reaction of a society to an act of violence should not only be indignation but also action. We must seek to restore justice, preserve life, and protect the vulnerable. The response to this tragedy was extreme, but it serves as a reminder that when human life is devalued, the consequences can be devastating and far-reaching. The lessons of Judges 19-21 also make us think about how we deal with the suffering of others. When the pain of one person is ignored or disregarded, it can spread and affect an entire community. The story of Gibeah teaches us that the suffering of one person is not an isolated event but has the power to touch everyone around us. The violence and disrespect for human life in Gibeah resulted in a civil war, which was devastating for the entire nation of Israel. This reminds us that every action has a broader impact, and that our choices, even those that seem personal, can affect an entire community. When we think about the lessons we can draw from this horrendous act, one thing stands out: the importance of honoring and protecting human dignity. The violence that occurred in Gibeah not only destroyed a life, but also affected the entire nation of Israel. What we learn from this is that when we fail to protect and respect life, the consequences can be devastating, both at a personal and collective level. Biblical lessons teach us to value human life as a gift from God, and it is this view that should guide our actions and decisions. As the story unfolds, the tribes of Israel, outraged by the act of violence in Gibeah, begin to take measures to seek justice. But the question remains, what more could have been done to prevent this tragic event? The answer leads us to the next point, where we will see the devastating consequences of actions that, although motivated by a search for justice, end up leading to a civil war and an even greater loss of life. What seemed like an attempt at justice soon turns into something much larger, and the destruction only increases. The consequences of the horrendous act of violence in Gibeah, as narrated in Judges chapters 19-21, are not limited to the immediate suffering of the victims. The impact of this crime triggers a series of events that culminate in a civil war between the tribes of Israel, a tragedy that affects the entire nation. When the Levite sends the parts of his concubine's body to the tribes, a cry for justice quickly spreads. The tribes unite in indignation, but soon, this indignation turns into a cycle of vengeance, where thousands of lives are lost. The story reveals how poor decisions, like the violence in Gibeah, can escalate and have far-reaching consequences, affecting not only those directly involved but the entire community. What could have been a moment of restoration and quick resolution turns into a spiral of destruction. Instead of seeking reconciliation and justice peacefully, the tribes of Israel choose to respond with violence, resulting in a civil war. The Bible teaches us that violence, when not dealt with wisely and compassionately, tends to generate more violence. The tragedy of Gibeah is a clear example of how the absence of true leadership, aligned with God's principles, can lead to devastating consequences. The civil war that follows is a demonstration of the destructive power that a lack of discernment and responsibility can have on an entire community. This civil war, which lasts several days, results in thousands of deaths, and destruction spreads throughout the nation. The tribes of Israel, in their attempt to seek justice, end up destroying each other. The story of Judges 19-21 teaches us that when people act based on revenge instead of seeking peace and reconciliation, the damage is much greater. Vengeance never leads to true restoration, but instead deepens division and destruction. In trying to correct the injustice done in Gibeah with more violence, the tribes of Israel, in fact, worsen the situation and cause irreparable damage to their own unity. Furthermore, this civil war also demonstrates the failure to recognize biblical responsibility. The tribes of Israel fail to see that, by engaging in a struggle between themselves, they are violating the principles of unity and brotherhood that God has always taught. The Bible is clear in teaching us that we must seek peace, forgive, and work for the unity of the body of Christ. And the civil war between the tribes of Israel is a tragic illustration of what happens when these principles are ignored. The conflict could have been resolved in a much more constructive way, but the failure to understand the true nature of justice and responsibility led to an endless spiral of violence. In a society where violence and revenge are seen as solutions to problems, the results are always disastrous. The tribes of Israel, by engaging in a civil war, lose more than just their lives. They lose the ability to unite and restore peace. The lesson we can learn from this is that, Often, the consequences of our actions are not immediate, but accumulate over time, and destruction can be much greater than we imagine. What started with an act of violence in Gibeah quickly turned into a war that devastated an entire nation. The civil war between the tribes of Israel also shows how the lack of solid leadership and divine direction can lead to tragic consequences. When a nation lacks a clear leader, guided by moral and spiritual principles, it becomes vulnerable to internal divisions and chaos. In Judges 19-21, the absence of just leadership faithful to God leaves the tribes of Israel at the mercy of destruction, like a flock without a shepherd. The lack of a strong leader to guide the people toward peace and unity was one of the main factors that caused the civil war and the loss of so many lives. Moreover, this civil war shows the impact of a failure of leadership on the responsibility of each individual within a community. What we saw in Judges 19-21 is a reflection of how, in times of crisis, people can be driven by their feelings of vengeance and anger instead of seeking solutions that bring peace. Biblical responsibility teaches us that, in times of conflict, we must be peacemakers, but the lack of divine direction and wisdom led the tribes of Israel to engage in an endless cycle of violence. The tragedy that unfolded is a direct reflection of the failure to act with responsibility and discernment in the face of a crisis. The number of lives lost during this civil war is a reminder of the depth of the consequences our actions can have. The war, which was initially provoked by an act of violence, becomes an endless cycle in which everyone loses. The loss of lives and the destruction of Israel's unity are a direct result of the poor decisions made by the tribes of Israel. What seemed like a pursuit of justice turned into a total disaster, and this teaches us that, without divine guidance, any attempt to correct a wrong can end up creating an even greater evil. The story of Judges 19-21 is a clear warning about the dangers of revenge and the lack of just leadership. Revenge never brings true justice, only more pain and destruction. What began as a horrendous crime turned into a cycle of violence that affected the entire nation, showing that when a society fails to seek peace, the consequences are devastating. When God's principles are not followed, society as a whole suffers. And this suffering is a reflection of the choices made by each individual, which, without responsibility, affects the entire collective. And as we look at the civil war that followed, we can see that it was not just a physical war, but a spiritual war, a battle against the very values of unity and brotherhood that God always asked His people to follow. The final lesson of Judges 19-21 is clear. The consequences of poor decisions can be much greater than we imagine, and it is each of our responsibilities to ensure that, in times of crisis, we do not stray from the peace and unity that God desires for all. The tragic story of Judges 19-21 does not end merely with a lament about the mistakes made, but offers lessons that are essential for our own spiritual journey. The tribes of Israel, by engaging in a civil war that devastated their own families and communities, teach us the importance of responsibility, human dignity, and connection with God. The lack of leadership, disrespect for human life, and failure to seek peace are themes that permeate the entire narrative, but at the same time, they point us to the deeper lessons we need to learn. The first of these lessons is that responsibility is key to building a just and united society. Without responsibility, any action, no matter how small, can have disastrous consequences. And the story of Judges 19-21 is a clear example of this. In moments of crisis, as we see in the tribes of Israel, it is essential for each person, each tribe to ask, how can I contribute to peace and the resolution of this problem? The lack of effective leadership in Israel led to a spiral of violence, and this was only possible because no one took responsibility for the situation. When people fail to act with responsibility and compassion, the result is chaos. This is a lesson that applies to any context, whether in society, a family, or our own hearts. When we disconnect from our responsibility to others, the consequences can be devastating, as we saw throughout this story. Human dignity is also a principle that cannot be neglected. The abuse and death of the Levite's concubine, followed by the civil war, tragically illustrate how the devaluation of human life leads to destruction. The Bible, in its many narratives, teaches us that every life is precious and that we must act with respect and care for everyone around us. When we fail to recognize human dignity, we not only fail the people around us, but also fail God, who created each of us in His image. In a world where violence and injustice are frequent, it is essential that, as followers of Christ, we continue to fight for the dignity of every person, regardless of their social position or circumstance. Another fundamental lesson we can take from this story is the importance of maintaining a constant connection with God. The tribes of Israel failed to seek divine direction, and this led to catastrophe. In our personal lives, this also applies. When we distance ourselves from God and begin to make decisions without consulting His will, the consequences can be disastrous. The Bible is clear in teaching us that God's wisdom is the key to making correct decisions. The lack of connection with God is not only a spiritual issue, but a practical one, as our choices shape our destiny and the destiny of those around us. Furthermore, this story reminds us of the importance of listening to and following biblical teachings, especially when it comes to issues like justice, peace, and reconciliation. The fact that the tribes of Israel engaged in a civil war instead of seeking peace is a failure of spiritual discernment. The Bible teaches us, in passages like Romans 12 verse 18, that we should do everything possible to live in peace with everyone, and, if possible, resolve our disputes peacefully. When we choose war instead of seeking forgiveness and reconciliation, the consequences are inevitably negative, not only for the people directly involved but for the whole community. The lessons of Judges 19 to 21 teach us that peace and justice can only be achieved when everyone acts with responsibility, respect for human dignity, and a heart focused on God. The story also challenges us to consider how our own actions can affect those around us. The decision of one person, in this case, the Levite, triggered a chain reaction that caused the death of many and the destruction of a significant portion of Israel. This is a powerful reminder that our choices have a much larger impact than we imagine, and it is crucial to act with discernment and responsibility. Finally, the story leads us to reflect on how willing we are to fight for justice, human dignity, and peace. The people of Israel, instead of uniting in a search for a peaceful solution, fell into the trap of vengeance and war. This makes us ask, at what moments in our lives have we been tempted to seek justice by our own hands, instead of seeking divine wisdom? How can we apply the lessons of Judges 19 to 21 in our own context and be agents of peace and reconciliation? As we conclude the story of Judges, we realize that the tragedy that unfolded could have been avoided with a bit more discernment, faith, and responsibility. True transformation, both individually and collectively, begins with the decision to live according to God's principles, in harmony with human dignity, and with an unrelenting pursuit of peace. This is the fundamental lesson that the story of Judges leaves us. When we stray from God and from our duties to one another, the result will always be disastrous. And now, with these fundamental lessons in mind, what can we learn about the urgent need for reconciliation and healing? For, as we will see, the true lessons of restoration begin to be applied in the midst of the destruction caused by wrong decisions. What follows is a move towards healing, responsibility, and justice, which is something we need to explore further. Now that you've explored the depths of this powerful biblical story, I ask you, what will you do with everything you've learned? Are you willing to apply these lessons in your life before it's too late? The story of Judges 19 to 21 teaches us, in a painful way, that our actions have a far greater impact than we realize. And when we fail to take responsibility for our choices, the consequences can be devastating, not just for us, but for everyone around us. How are you handling your own decisions? Are you seeking justice peacefully, or have you been swept away by anger, vengeance, and chaos? No matter where you are, the lessons of Judges can change your life. Reflect on how you can be a force for reconciliation and peace in a world that often chooses conflict. And remember, true change begins with your connection to God. If you want to keep learning how to apply these principles in your life, subscribe to our channel, turn on notifications, and stay tuned for more impactful stories. You can be the difference the world needs. Let's move forward together, towards peace and true responsibility.